Now, it's my pleasure to introduce this masterclass, which is on the one most important topic in sustainability of the second half of 2021. In the lead up to the Glasgow climate talks, the buzz of net zero. We've heard a lot about it. We've seen a lot in the press, and we know this is going to be one of the most important movements in sustainability going forward. But what the hell is net zero? And so we embarked on a path to help define that, to help bring about proper ways of addressing net zero in the hotel industry. So it's my pleasure to introduce my colleagues from Greenview, Olivia Ruggles-Brise and Sahil Aggarwal, who are going to break down what is net zero from the basics, the key issues, and where it's going to go in the future in 2022 and beyond through 2050. So Sahil, Olivia, please take it away.
Hi, Eric and Bill, and thanks for inviting us to take part in PHIST this year. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our masterclass on net zero. Everything you wanted to know about net zero, but were afraid to ask. I'm Olivia Ruggles-Brise.
And I'm Sahil Aggarwal.
And we're from Greenview. Today, we're going to give you the rundown on hotels and net zero. And what better place to start than what is net zero? And more importantly, what is it not? Over to Sahil, who will explain more.
Thanks, Olivia. So net zero has become a buzzword. There are a lot of similar terminologies which are being used interchangeably, such as carbon neutrality, carbon negative, or climate positive. But if I can just quickly explain the differences between these terms. So first, carbon neutral means when human-caused CO2 emissions are balanced by human-caused CO2 removals, whereas net zero emissions are achieved when human-caused GHG emissions are balanced by human-caused GHG removals. So the key distinction here is that in carbon neutrality, it only considers CO2 as a GHG, whereas in net zero emissions, it considers all the forms of GHGs. Also, another distinction that is usually observed here is that companies generally claim carbon neutrality by simply purchasing the equal amount of offsets that they emit. Whereas with net zero, it has gone one step further and the whole notion has changed. The concept of net zero strongly encourages to reduce as much emissions as possible within your value chain and then using offsets as last resort for whatever emissions are residual. Then there are terms such as carbon negative and climate positive, which are two similar terms. It occurs when a company removes or captures more CO2 from the atmosphere than it emits. In that case, the company has a negative amount of carbon emissions and it positively impacts the climate. So, for example, you must have commonly heard of Bhutan, which is the only carbon negative country that sequesters more carbon than what it emits. Lastly, there's also a term which is being often used, which is zero carbon. And this means that zero carbon emissions are being produced from a product or a service. For example, if you can take a zero carbon electricity system would be a system where 100% of the electricity is coming from a renewable energy source. So now I pass it to Olivia to explain about the difference in scopes and the net zero and how to apply them to hotels. Over to you, Olivia.
Thanks, Sahil. So yes, now to scopes, the basis of all carbon accounting. So the Greenhouse Gas Protocol divides emissions into three scopes. Scope 1 are direct emissions from owned or controlled sources. So for a hotel, this means the combustion of fuels on site, transportation of the guests to or from the hotel in transport that's owned by the hotel, and fugitive emissions. Scope 2 emissions, on the other hand, are indirect emissions from the generation of purchased energy. So this includes purchased electricity, heating, and cooling that a hotel might do. And then scope 3 emissions are all other direct emissions in the upstream and downstream value chain. So if you think about it, there are a huge number of potential scope 3 emissions for a hotel, including outsourced laundry, downstream waste, upstream emissions from food services and equipment, the transport of guests within the destination when the transport itself is not owned by the hotel, embodied carbon of the building, employee commuting, and business travel, to name just a few. And as Sahil said, the thing about net zero is that it requires companies to address not just their direct and purchased emissions, but also their scope 3 emissions, their whole supply chain. So for hotels, this isn't just about on-site generated or purchased electricity, heating and cooling, but all the other activities that go into a hotel building and operations. And Sahil's going to talk more about this later, so I won't go into too much detail right now on the supply chain side of things. But not only is it complicated to map out and understand the scope 3 emissions of a hotel, we also need to bear in mind that the hotel sector has a highly complex and fragmented ownership structure. So the question is not only what, but who. While a hotel might be known by the brand that it sits under, most often that brand does not own the hotel itself. And in many cases, the brand does not even manage the hotel. So who's responsible for what? To keep it simple, we've boiled it down to 3 points to remember. 1, both the hotel owner and operator have a responsibility for the carbon footprint of a hotel. 2, these will overlap, but generally speaking can be divided into the building or CapEx side, which is the responsibility of the owner, and the operations or OpEx side, which is the operator. And where a hotel is franchised, the franchisor, the brand, should include the property in their own Scope 3, i.e. supply chain emissions. So, for example, if you have a hotel company such as Marriott that has franchised a particular hotel and therefore it does neither own the building nor operate it, then Marriott would include that property within their own Scope 3 emissions, but not Scope 1 and 2. But what does Scope 3 mean exactly for a hotel? I'll hand back now to Sahil, who will explain how it works.
Right. So thanks, Olivia. That was interesting. And now coming to the Scope 3. So as rightly mentioned by Olivia, that the hotel industry is quite complex. It has different ownership structures. So quantifying Scope 3 emissions for hotels is also very challenging because of the nature of the business. For most business, Scope 3 would relate to the company's product supply chain. However, for hotels, there's a whole universe of Scope 3 emissions. So for example, if I can just name a few, Scope 3 emissions from hotels could include emissions from purchased goods and services such as stationery materials, bottled amenities, F&B items, linens and towels, or other outsourced services such as data servers, laundry, and softwares. There are emissions from capital goods such as durable goods, which includes electronic items. There's FF&E, which includes furnitures, and then there's the whole embodied carbon of the building. Third type of a source could be the grid loss, which includes the transmission and distribution losses in electricity. There's the downstream disposal of waste generated in operations. So, for example, if a hotel emits a lot of waste, so that waste finally goes to landfill, and that leads to methane emissions. There's the business travel side of the source. There's the employee commute. And then one which is very common in the hotel industries is the franchise properties, because a lot of the hotel operators, as mentioned by Olivia, they don't really own the building. They operate it, so they have a lot of franchise properties. So the Scope 1 and 2 emissions of the franchise properties would be accounted for as Scope 3 for the hotels. Then there's also the sources related to the guests, such as the guests' air travel, the ground travel of the guests, and the local travel and sightseeing and the recreational activities that they will be involved in. Now, as you can see, there are potentially hundreds of sources of emissions, and to expect hotels to track and report the emissions from these sources from all their value chain is just not possible. Therefore, for the net zero journey, the recommendation is that hotels actively start screening their value chain and identify the most potential sources of emissions of Scope 3. So start collecting data, keep a track, and report on all these emissions. For all other sources where the data is not readily available, so you have to look out for these on publicly available resources, tools. You have to find the right default factors or default data. Then based on this, you have to estimate your entire Scope 3 emissions and then engage with other industry members and stakeholders to address the Scope 3 emissions in the hotel industry. Now, one important question that hotels actively seek is how to achieve net zero. And this is where Olivia comes in, and she will explain the various options available to hotels.
Thanks, Sahil. So within all the complexity of Scopes 1, 2, and 3, what can hotels actually do to achieve net zero? Well, at the end of the day, it's all about energy. So the first thing to do is to reduce the amount of energy you consume, LED lighting, efficient heating and cooling systems, etc. Although this may involve upfront costs, often the efficiencies mean cost savings in the end. Then, assuming that you still need to consume energy, the most effective way to move towards net zero is to use renewable energy, solar, wind, etc. However, we're still a long way off this being really a feasible approach for all hotels around the world. And there are some great examples, particularly on island hotels or resorts where renewable energy is generated on site. But for the vast majority of hotels, this is the challenge, particularly when it comes to challenges around storing that energy when it can't be generated. So the real opportunity comes from grid decarbonisation. As energy grids around the world move to renewable sources, wind, solar or nuclear, this will have an enormous impact on the ability of hotels to achieve net zero. But this is dependent on national or regional approaches to decarbonisation. Some parts of the world are more advanced than others, and Southeast Asia is definitely not leading the way in this regard. So the other option is to purchase energy attribute certificates or renewable energy certificates. These show that the renewable energy has been produced and added to the grid. So even if that energy is not the energy used in your hotel, it can show that an equivalent amount of renewable energy was generated elsewhere. And don't worry if this is all quite complicated. Sahil's going to tell you more about this in a minute. Finally, while of course it's vital that the hotel or hotel company reduces its energy usage and moves to renewables as fast as possible, there is also a huge opportunity that the hotel has to engage its supply chain. So you can look at also setting targets for how you engage with suppliers and the expectations you place on them. So you could state that you will only purchase amenities from a company with a credible net zero commitment, for example. And ultimately, this approach will drive change throughout the system. And we're already seeing it with some big customers, such as Salesforce, for example, requiring that all their vendors have net zero commitments. So this is really starting to gain traction. And there's a huge opportunity here for the hotel sector to be part of that movement as well. But as I said, renewables are really where the opportunities lie. So Sahil's going to give you a bit more depth on how they work and how you can implement a renewable energy strategy. Back to you, Sahil.
Yes, so renewable energy is definitely an important way through which hotels can realize the net zero pathway. There are multiple ways through which hotels can embrace renewable energy. So the first one is on-site renewable energy. Now, this is when the hotels install renewable energy technologies such as solar panels, wind turbines, and etc., which are one of the direct ways available to a hotel to meet their energy needs. Already, there are several examples in the world where hotels are already using renewable energy on site. However, on-site renewable energy is just not possible for all hotels because there are a lot of financial, space, and market constraints in the locations where hotels are based. Also, there are challenges related to battery storage, which may not fit into the existing hotels. So to address this, there's another option which is available to the hotels, which is the PPA, and it's called as the power purchase agreements. Now, this is a contract between two parties where one generates the electricity and the other purchases the electricity regardless of the site of the electricity. And within this, there are multiple options. So first is the physical PPA, where the contract includes the physical delivery of electricity. The second is the virtual PPA, where the contract excludes the physical delivery of electricity and the seller sells the renewable electricity to the utility, and the buyer can keep purchasing its original electricity from the grid and simply buy the environmental attributes of the system. Now here, there is an interplay of a fixed price and a wholesale price of the electricity, which is adjusted and compensated between the buyer and the seller. Now, I don't want to get into too much details of that, and you can check out more resources on that. There's a third type of a PPA, which is the sleeve PPA. And in this, the utility acts as an intermediary to transfer the money and energy. Here, the buyer does not need to be intimately familiar with the power market dynamics and is not subject to any power market price fluctuations. Now, one recent example of PPA in the hotel industry is the MGM Resorts, who recently entered into a 20-year PPA agreement with Invenergy to purchase solar power from a solar farm in Las Vegas to power its 13 resorts in Las Vegas. So as you can see, so PPA are a very good and a flexible option, but what happens is it makes you enter into a long-term lock-in period, which is often hard to get out of and to negotiate. There's a third option, which is energy attribute certificates, or the EACs. And these are tradable energy certificates that represent proof that 1 megawatt hour of electricity was generated from a renewable energy source. So as you know, that power on the grid comes from various sources, which are all blended together. So it's very difficult for the user to tell from where their electricity is coming from. So businesses purchase energy attribute certificates to certify that they have a valid claim to renewable energy and to offset the electricity consumption from their fossil fuels. Now, EACs are also sometimes called by different names in different regions, such as guarantees of origin in EU, RECs in US, and IRECs in international markets. However, the principle for all these are the same. If I can just share from where RECs can be purchased. So there are three options. There's the utilities itself. So in US, there are almost 850 utilities which offer green power programs and RECs to their customers. Then there's the auctions and exchanges. So entities covered by mandatory national and regional renewable energy programs and obligations can purchase RECs through national registries and auctions by bidding. Then finally, we can also purchase RECs from traders, brokers, and consultants who can help you procure these RECs. On similar lines, there's another commodity which is widely popular and called as offsets. I know there are various different standpoints on it. There's a lot of debate going on whether offsets are good or bad and whether it can be used for net zero. But I think Olivia can help clear that confusion, so I'll hand it over to her.
Thanks, Sahil. Yeah, let's look at offsets for a few minutes. Most people have heard of offsets, but they're getting an increasingly bad press. And as Sahil was saying, everybody has their own view on whether offsets are a good or a bad thing. And it's true, the market is burgeoning with different offset calculators and providers, many of which are unregulated. And all too often, companies use offsetting as a get-out-of-jail-free card when trying to become carbon neutral. But for net zero, it's clear offsetting should be a last resort, and only once you've reduced emissions as far as possible should offsetting be considered. So it needs to be recognised that for certain Scope 3 emissions, which are largely outside of the control of a hotel, offsetting, if done properly, can provide a good solution to ultimately achieving net zero. And what do I mean by done properly? Well, there are several attributes of a good carbon offset. First of all, they should be verified. So verifying offsets ensures that the emission reduction or carbon removal actually takes place. And when you're buying offsets, you need to ensure that those offsets have undergone a rigorous validation and verification by a third-party organisation and received certification from a credible carbon standard in a voluntary or compliance market. Secondly, you need to make sure that forward selling is minimised. And what this means is that any time gap between the purchase of the offset and the successful execution of the emission reducing or carbon removing activity must be minimised, and mechanisms to ensure that the environmental benefits from an offset are actually delivered must be strong. So you can't buy an offset which actually does not undertake the offsetting for several years. It should be done immediately. Thirdly, you should make sure that they are accurately accounted. So care must be taken to ensure offset providers are properly converting the climate impacts of non-CO2 climate pollutants into CO2 terms according to their actual warming impact, and particularly for short-lived greenhouse gases like methane. Fourthly, and this is a really important one, offsets should also be additional, meaning they represent an emission reduction or carbon removal relative to a baseline that would not have taken place but for the offsetting activity. Additionality can be difficult to determine and verify and ultimately involves some degree of subjectivity. But there are key questions that buyers can ask to determine whether the offset project is additional or not. And the Carbon Offset Guide has a lot more details and guidance, which you can take a look at. And then offsets need to be permanent. So permanent refers to how long a greenhouse gas stays out of the atmosphere, whether stored in a physical reservoir or whose emission was deferred through avoidance. In the case of physically storing carbon in a reservoir, such as a forest or a geological sink, the risk of reversal of that carbon back into the atmosphere must be acknowledged and accounted for in the offsetting plan. For example, afforestation or reforestation generates carbon removal offsets, but if forests are subsequently cut down or destroyed by pests, fire, or other natural disturbances, the stored carbon is reversed and the carbon offset must be invalidated. And then offsets should also be co-beneficial. So it's essential that in addition to contributing to significant emissions reduction, the carbon offset should also realise environmental and social equity and integrity. A project should also demonstrate it complies with all the legal requirements in the jurisdiction where it's located. So depending on the type of project and the jurisdiction where it's located, additional reviews and safeguards may be necessary to guard against negative outcomes unrelated to the GHG emissions. And finally, and this is where tourism and hospitality has an additional opportunity when it comes to offsetting, carbon offsets relating to hotel emissions should also create a nexus of benefits between the offsetting and tourism, so that the offset projects also benefit local economies and heritage, the sustainable tourism equity principle. So offsets not only reduce or remove emissions, but they also benefit tourism destinations and communities, and you create a virtuous circle of benefits, which ultimately contributes towards net zero and a more healthy tourism environment. So I know this has all been a lot to take in, and we've talked about what is net zero, the difference between scopes 1, 2, and 3, specifically what scope 3 means for hotels. We've also looked at actions you can take with a focus on renewable energy and offsets. But you're probably wondering, great, but how do I go about getting started? Well, back to Sahil, who has some tips to get you going.
Thanks, Olivia. So yes, there are 8 steps which I could recommend. So first is model your portfolio's baseline and forecasted metrics. So data points such as room count, floor area, number of hotels, the grid emission factors, and your scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So all these points are important as they are the key drivers of the hotel's net zero pathway. So finalizing the historical and forecasted figures for these are important. Then secondly, engage others in the value chain. So as with most other aspects of sustainability, the buy-in and integration into the company's strategy and this company's processes are important. And therefore, engage with your internal and external stakeholders is very important. Third, study the portfolio's opportunities for energy efficiency. Identify the various measures that can be implemented across the portfolio on energy efficiency, such as energy efficiency lighting, fit-outs, transitioning to complete electricity, then also upgrading your kitchen equipment, etc., are very important. Fourth, start looking into the potential RE options. So working with other stakeholders and consultants to identify opportunities of energy procurement and on-site installation. Like I already explained earlier, that there are 3 main approaches to RE which hotels can embrace, which is the on-site RE, PPAs, and RECs. Identify which is the most suitable for you and the most applicable for your hotel. Fifth, there's identify and quantify your scope 3 emission sources. As I also mentioned previously, screening your value chain, identifying the most significant sources of emissions of scope 3, collect their data and keep a track of all these emissions. Then for all other sources for which data is not available, look out for the best available tools, default factors, and default data, and then estimate using the publicly available tools. Sixth, explore carbon offsetting. So in line with what Olivia had already explained, explore carbon offsetting and see how they can play a role in your net zero journey. So for this, you have to keep abreast of the current carbon markets and the policy trends as well. Seventh, model and set a decarbonization pathway. As we know that the goal for all is net zero by 2050, set a decarbonization pathway by talking the various variables such as your portfolio composition, your power grid factors, energy efficiency, renewable energy, and offsets. So based on these parameters, these are the drivers of your net zero, and based on these parameters only, you'll be able to determine what your net zero pathway will look like. Then finally, once you have set your pathway, set the commitment, and transparent this and communicate this to external audiences. Now, there are various guidance, methodologies, initiatives that are coming out that may further help you in navigating through the right resources. And I think, Olivia, you're the right person to explain the various initiatives that are coming out in the coming days and weeks.
Thanks, Sahil. That was a great overview of the steps that hotels can take. And we know this is a complex world, but one which hotels are increasingly expected to engage with. So as Sahil said, before we sign off, I just wanted to share with you some resources which were available or which will soon be available that can help you. So first of all, the Net Zero methodology for hotels will be launched next month. This is a comprehensive guide to everything we've covered today and much, much more. It'll be available via our website, www.greenview.sg, but also on other industry websites, and we can share that when it's available. Also, due to be published in the next day or so, is the Science-Based Targets Initiative Guide to Net Zero. Now, we haven't really talked about science-based targets today, as their relevance beyond the largest companies is still to be determined, but they will certainly be setting the outline for how to approach this going forward. So it's worth a read once they've launched that piece. And then for those of you who are active in meetings and events, there's a new initiative from the events industry to help you. Visit www.netzerocarbonevents.org to find out more. And finally, COP26 will be taking place over the next 2 weeks, and we're expecting a whole range of guidances, pathways, and roadmaps to be launched, both for the wider tourism sector, but also hotels and hospitality. So keep your eye out for them. There'll certainly be no shortage of resources to help you address net zero over the coming months.
So there we go. Hopefully, we have helped you gain a deeper understanding of what it means to be net zero and how you can go about it. If you have any questions, please get in touch with us or our website, www.greenview.sg.
Thank you. So that's all from us. Enjoy the rest of the PHIST sessions. Now back to Eric and the team. Thanks, guys.
Thank you. That was great. That was a lot. My head's going to explode. I think I'm going to need to take a break, take a little nap after that one. But thank you very much, Liv and Sahil. And really looking forward to seeing where this can go and where the hotel industry can catalyze sustainable tourism.